Hello and welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery. I'm Kat Sheridan, director of the space, and I am here with curator Tracy Longley-Cook to talk about this exhibition. Tell us a little bit about it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to the Rife Gallery and the Ohio Arts Council for allowing this to happen. This show, Metamorphosis, is about change, regeneration, growth, transition from one passage of place and time to another. And the artists, we have 12 Ohio artists that are in this exhibition. We're going to take the opportunity to introduce some of the work to you today.
Perfect. So we're right in front of Andrew's work. Maybe we should chat about him first. Tell us about Andrew's work.
So Andrew Daly is based in Dayton, Ohio, and he primarily works with graphite on panel. As you can see, it's a nice wide selection of different works dealing with nature. So we've got, tree branches, root systems, some animals, and really this beautiful non-linear pathway of drawings, I think is a beautiful representation of the human condition. So we've got fragmentation, we've got regeneration, we have symbols of growth and different placement, which is pretty exciting. There's almost a cabinet of curiosity sort of representation here with this placement and different what almost look like artifacts, carefully placed on this white, plain, non-contextual background, which I think is exciting.
What's nice about this too is you have all of these kind of highlighted almost portraits of like root balls or cut pieces that haven't been hewn to a specific shape. So it's highlighting things that are in transition from living to unliving.
Absolutely, and I think it elevates their importance when they're placed in that frame and given this, a tree branch, what you might find on the floor of on the sidewalk or street or park or something, is elevated into this, important space and into this gallery where, we should look at that regeneration. We should look at that transitional place, those cuts, those transformations that happen within the work. So.
It almost feels like botanical drawings, right?
Yes, it's and it's anatomy drawings, kind of like similar to that,
Yeah, it's also the time and attention that the artist gives each of these individual pieces gives them importance just by the nature of taking time to record them.
Absolutely.
So we have a really fun added value for Andrew in that this piece over here on the wall will continue to metamorphosize
and evolve,
throughout the exhibition. He'll be coming back 3 times and working for a couple of hours on this work. So if folks are interested in seeing an artist at work demoing what he is actually pretty well known for, doing these direct on the wall pieces. He has a beautiful one at Wright State.
Yes.
Stay tuned for that.
And if I could add on to that, one thing that is important to acknowledge with these on-the-wall pieces is that they are temporal. They will only be here for a small amount of time. So this will be painted over. It will only exist for a finite amount of time. And while a lot of work and detail and labor will go into it, it's all with the idea that this will one day just be painted over. So that's a little bit different in terms of artistic permanence, which is often thought about, whereas this is temporary.
Ethereal, for sure.
It's exciting.
All right, so let's hit our next artist. Tell us about Rachel.
Oh, Rachel's a wonderful Cincinnati artist. She is a photographer, and what we're seeing here is from a portfolio entitled Pulse. And these are, just to give you some context to the type of photography, because it looks a little unusual if you're familiar with photography. These are digital enlargements of one-of-a-kind lumen prints. And lumen prints is where you're taking traditional darkroom silver paper, exposing it to out just the sun for a lengthy amount of time, and there's a organic change, physical change that's happening with the materials of what's directly placed on the paper and the paper itself with the chemistry of the paper. And then it's treated and scanned and so forth and enlarged. And Rachel is working with elements of the body. These are historical anatomical drawings that she is working with, cutting and placing onto the paper, along with botanical materials. And you can see, particularly by the halo in some of the work that exists around the botanical materials, you're seeing that actual chemical reaction. So another sort of link to material transformation of the botanical onto the paper itself. So, and the enlargement, the original ends up sort of fading away once it's scanned, and so the enlargement or the digital scan ends up being a lasting component of the piece.
There's a little element of chance in these too.
Absolutely, 100%. 100%, which is sometimes a little nerve-wracking for an artist to be working with. But you can see the references to the body are, our bodies are experiencing constant change, whether that's blood flow, cell regeneration, neuron synapses, et cetera, et cetera. We constantly experience change. And so we're looking at some interesting aspects from birth, like the umbilical cord, the heart, the skull, and then these botanical changes, linking this to a larger environmental theme, and linking the body to the environment.
So I have a curiosity for you, Tracy.
Yeah.
And Rachel was really specific on these triptychs and duos and how she wants to place them together.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about your interpretation of that?
Wow, yes. I think, well, there's definitely a flow. So we've got, for example, this triptych here, and we can see the flow of the umbilical cord twisting and turning and stretching out in this elongated pattern. And then we have, hands reaching, and this piece to my left, and then legs extending here to the piece to the right. So I think the triptych and the diptych, extends the picture plane in part, and just expands the way the materials can interact with the surface of the paper. Is that what you're asking?
It also creates a visual interest
Yeah,
to break it up
absolutely.
and not make it so formal right next to each other.
Right.
To have some above and some kind of stilted and asymmetrical creates a little added visual interest.
I love,
is lovely.
Yeah, I love the way you say that, and I think even just the way this situates, these three sets situate on the wall, provides different height, it's sort of almost musical movement.
Absolutely.
That has a nice rhythm to it, and then that's nicely echoed by some of the single pieces that exist around the space as well.
Perfect.
Yay.
Perfect. Let's go have a look at Carrie's work.
Yeah. So Carrie Longley is a ceramic artist based in Brookville, Ohio. And you can see these just beautiful ceramic pieces referencing, for me, so many things. I see seed pods, I see underwater creatures, I see the anatomy of bugs, beetles, and maybe even lizards or other sorts of animals like that. There's a reference to sort of skeletal structure, even a little human, like maybe the pelvis or something right here, and linking that all the way to something that's maybe even cellular, So I love the sense of scale here, and thinking about all these different physical forms that exist around us, and the way she's linking them together has a real visual engagement to me. Like I really get engaged with looking at the work and picking apart all these details. One thing that I'm really interested in this work is she lives on a farm, and so she's both a gardener, and her kids are really, she's a mother, and she's also, her kids are really involved with 4-H. And so her experience with growth and regeneration and death, right, that is a real big part of her life. And I think that really comes through the work. Notice the black or darkness of the pieces themselves. It's almost like they're drying out, or they're at the end of a phase. Maybe it's a cocoon that will open soon. Maybe it's something that's drying up and being finished. And these little extensions on the wire almost feel like seed pods that might drop, regenerate into a new growth. And so I'm interested in Carrie's personal experience as a farmer, an artist, and a mother, thinking about the body and the bodies from other kind of animals as this regenerative component.
The necessary cyclical nature of life.
Absolutely, and what better way to talk about transformation than through that?
They're really otherworldly.
Very much, like you could say alien, right?
Alien, really. Yeah. But also, like it feels like they could get up and walk away.
Absolutely, absolutely. They'd have a real life to them.
And to imagine the amount of time and effort it takes to not only create them, but to balance them. And the craftsmanship within this is also pretty astounding.
Absolutely. And there's, I love that you mentioned the way they're standing. I feel like these could exist in different ways. Like they could exist in an interesting way lying down. They can exist on a wall. They can exist sort of higher up, and we can look under them. I don't necessarily know they all have to be only seen one way. I love the display here that we're able to see behind the piece, in front of the piece, on top of it, and if we can get under, it's definitely worth the time to spend visually engaging all the details around each piece.
And so while we're still on ceramics, we're going to head over to the wall over here.
Yes.
Tell us about this artist.
So this is Justin Tealhead. He's based in Yellow Springs, Ohio. And I'm so engaged with this work. If you look closely, these, and they're quite large, as you can see by the scale, the human scale next to it, but these are made up of individual tiles, small little components that are layered on top of each other very slowly. Then they're ceramic. So each ceramic tile is individually placed by the hand of the artist. And you can see the sort of movement at the top. You might notice it kind of looks like maybe scales or sort of reptile-esque, but then it starts to lift up. Notice how it catches the light, and you start to see this almost like water ripple effect, something maybe akin to a river. And with this particular triptych, there's two triptychs here, one in red and one in black, you see that extension of the line patterns or ripple patterns, I'll say, through the triptych.
Yeah, just in visually observing them, the tight craftsmanship of it helps you recognize the amount of time.
Absolutely, it's so detailed.
Yeah, and time becomes material in pieces like this.
Absolutely.
And you look at it, and it also has, like you mentioned before with Rachel's work, this kind of musicality to it. Like you could imagine this being sound waves.
Yes.
And I think in a very visual way, this one speaks to Metamorphosis in a very literal, you can see the change and how it affects the physicality of it.
Absolutely.
It's really lovely. And the fact that they're monochromatic, single color, allows for you to see that language of movement even better.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned the monochromatic aspect, because yes, these tiles are all painted the same color, but the light shifts it, just like water. Like when you look at the surface of water, every time light hits a different sort of placement on that surface, it's going to change. And so we are seeing a materiality and change within that materiality. There's a lightness, there's a feeling of lightness from them, but these actual pieces are very heavy.
Incredible.
Because they are compiled of so many pieces of ceramic, one built on top of each other. So a little bit of an illusion here.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And a perfect dovetail, speaking of water, we're gonna head over to
Beautiful.
Melissa's piece over here.
Exactly.
Tell us about Melissa.
Melissa Haviland is from Athens, Ohio. She is a printmaker. However, you can see with this particular work, she has taken printmaking in kind of a new realm. We're looking at a large-scale sculptural installation of coils of paper that have prints on them. So, and if you have the opportunity to look closely, you'll notice that from maybe stepping far away, you see this, immense color of blue, these, pathways, as Kat mentioned, this reference to waves and water and movement on a large scale. On the actual piece itself, you'll see these different swirling motions, also referencing the wave mark, okay, and rolling waves and so forth. But I also want you to notice, sort of embedded in those individual coils of blue, you'll see more intimate objects that are more domestic interior objects, a little stool, a plant, a chair, a stairway, a teapot, etc. And when you get to these, you have to be physically close to it to see these little intimate details of the space. And I really love the sense, the dual experience, I guess I'll put it, say the experience you have of this piece from a distance and the experiences you can have with it close up. I love that dialogue between the external, maybe the environmental world, and the interior, domestic, or perhaps emotional, personal world.
And how they're so knit together.
Exactly. We are not separate from that environmental world,
That's right?
Yeah.
That's right. And this artist is deeply, deeply interested in investigating the impacts on climate for our lived experiences.
Yeah.
So really another fun bit that you may not know walking into this show is that this artist was really concerned about, when placing these particular posts that would then house the piece, that they be really random. There's no set agenda for how it will be, which Tracy and I were talking a little bit earlier. There's something really lovely about the fact that she insists upon a randomness, because then it kind of pulls in the old adage of you can't step into the same river twice, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Just really wonderful piece to greet us as we come into this exhibition.
And if the audience member ever has the option to see this again, it'll be a different construction, basically, because every installation is different, which I think is a very exciting thing. It transforms from space to space as it's placed, which I think is great. It's a very, very beautiful piece.
So speaking of Melissas, let's go see another Melissa.
Another Melissa. And this is a piece where I highly recommend you have that experience, like I mentioned with Melissa Havland, of looking at it from a distance, but also getting as close as what is safe and look at the detail. So this is work by Melissa Lusk. She's based in Cincinnati, Ohio, and has a background in weaving. And I'm very excited about this piece because it represents a very old medium. Weaving is hundreds and hundreds of years old. It's one of the oldest mediums that we have in terms of artistic or functional craftsmanship and art. But this also embraces newer technologies, because this is done with it's hand woven, but it uses a TC2 jacquard loom, which is a very sophisticated digital component layered onto the hand weaving. And to put it simply, it's lifting hundreds of strings from a computer. A computer is lifting hundreds of strings in order to do the hand weaving. So think of this as each pixel point, okay, because the source imagery is from digital, whether it's a digital photograph or a digital drawing, something like that. Think of each pixel as a thread or a binding point of the actual weave. And I love that our flow of this talk is going from Justin Tealhead to Melissa Haviland to Melissa Lusk, because you're going to see, I think, this continuity of this sort of wave. And I think this work actually also nicely references Carrie's work as well, into this, anamorphic, changing, evolving, floating.
It feels like a growth.
It
feels like it's
does.
growing.
Yes.
Maybe a flora type thing.
Right.
Another thing that I think is really lovely is that Tracy discovered Melissa Lusk through visiting the gallery and seeing an absolute stunner of a piece in the biennial last year.
Yes.
So, just a treat to be able to have that kind of symbiosis there, where you come in and you're like, now wait a second, who is this? And let me get to know that. And so now Melissa is a part of your kind of cadre of artists that you'll call upon.
Absolutely.
And what a treat.
Absolutely. And very much looking forward to work that will evolve with her, this particular loom and working methods.
Because it's relatively new. Like, she got that loom and busted
2 years
out
ago. Yeah.
a absolute standout piece that made it into the biennial, which is incredibly competitive. Was invited to be a part of this show and was able to create this stunner. So it's just a treat to kind of see that knitting
Absolutely.
come together.
Yeah. I think just maybe in closing, something to note when you're, as you probably noted when you were close, these kind of little kind of Flex, yeah, perfect word. Flex that kind of create this movement and this transition of, this yellowish green to this teal to white and black. I love the tactile quality. You really, from far away, you mentioned this work and the one I saw in the other show, where I thought it was a drawing from a distance, and I got in closer, I was like, that's fabric. Those are threads. And I love that discovery of the material through looking at the piece. I felt really engaged continually as I looked at it.
You get a treat.
It really is. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So let's come on over. We have more organic forms happening here. Tell us about this artist.
So this is Julie Abijanac, and she is located in Columbus, Ohio. Just a nice segue there. The materiality of these pieces are really, really stunning. Another, I think, just to take this moment with this show, a very different experience coming to look at the work in person. Because I spent a fair amount of time as a curator with these works in some sort of photographic form or on a computer or something. But seeing them in person, doing studio visits, and coming, of course, to see the final display and the exhibition layout, you really have this very different interaction with the work, seeing it and standing in front of it in person. So with Julie's work, you'll notice that there's a lot of layering, collage, building up the surface. One of my favorite things about Julie's work, and one of the things I was really drawn to about including her in this show, is you'll notice there are parts that are very abstract, like, for example, background structure and sort of layered, opaque and transparent little sections. But then we have this like almost front panel of a very structured component. Almost, it reminds me of something, a physical structure, like an architecture of sorts, but it also reminds me of biological structure. Nerve synapse, you know, cell structure, stuff like that, that, you know, we can look at maybe under a microscope or something. But that blend, or that sort of dialogue between the abstraction and almost, I know it's not accidental, but, you know, a mark making that is based, is sometimes actually placed and then removed in terms of her working process. You know, and then the handwork with this very structured sort of diamond triangle components that exist on top of that, whether it's drawn or cut pieces that kind of float a little bit on the surface.
The evidence of the hand is clearly important.
Absolutely.
And then the additional, she's creating histories to kind of navigate within the piece.
Yeah.
Which is another work that rewards you the longer you look at it, and maybe have a friend to chat about with it.
Yeah. And these works also reference the body, health, illness, transition points of the body as well. So I think those, while they sort of quietly lean into that, well, in some cases sort of quietly lean, some are a little more obvious, but I really love that transition, transformation, metamorphosis of the work in that respect as well.
Yeah. Perfect. Let's come on over and have a chat about Landon.
Yeah.
So vastly different.
Vastly different. We're looking at the work of Landon Cra, who's based in Dayton, Ohio. And we've got a number of different sculptures, some on cases. We have this large piece that I'm standing next to right here. And then behind me, some other pieces and a few wall components as well. One thing to note about Landon's work, sculptural work, and some 2D work here is the material. So you might note that this probably looks very familiar. This is materials like a 4x8 sheet of plywood or a 2x4, things that you can buy, are readily available at a big box store or something to that effect. And this is a way to reference internal structure. So what things are made with. You know, you can think of the, you see your own walls in your home every day, and that's, you know, the paint and maybe some of the drywall. But behind that, what's holding that up? What's the structural components and the materials and the hardware that are the fundamental skeleton of that structure? And so Landon really wants to sort of bring that out and make us look at those components as a physical material object, but also from a metaphorical point of view. What are those, what's the makeup of our psychological experience, our emotional experience? And so that's one of the reasons I included him in this show. He also alludes to sort of, mistakes might not be the right word, but like little fallible moments. Like we have these shims on this piece here. One is red, and it really pronounces itself as a quiet component of something that's being fixed, right? Or steadied, or made whole, or, you know, something along those lines. And then announced with that just small red mark. And color is an interesting component in Landon's work. Here in this piece, we have the plumb bob, and we have that kind of fluorescent orangish pink string leading our eye down to a point that interacts with this piece on the floor, that again is a ready-made object from a hardware store. This blue, which almost, you know, this crumpled, left behind kind of artifact. The blue has a kind of like link to the landscape, and the blue is actually from the same material that our is used on the pieces behind Cat here, which is a paint that is used on the bottom of ponds. And the color palette is just from layering that particular paint material. So, I think it's the purple and the black or the overlay, or, the most opaque use of the paint. And the blue and the teal are the most singular uses of the paint.
There's something really lovely in Landon's work that I think speak to his, career during the day.
Yes.
As well. So he does preparator work over in Dayton.
And a sculpture tech.
And as a sculpture tech. So there's a real love of the material and a want to highlight and celebrate the materials that are unsung. So oftentimes we finish the wood to cover it, to make it disappear. And in these particular instances, he really highlights the importance of those foundational materials.
Absolutely.
And I love that you talked about the shims. The craftsmanship in these are absolutely phenomenal. And he also indicates the importance of giving ourselves the opportunity for change. So whether that be using a blue tape to, keep a line straight, or the dots of welding, or a spot of wood filler. These become part of the work and an important component that highlight. And a fun story that one of the preparators shared with me after working with Landon, in this particular piece, he was working through it and getting frustrated, not feeling like it was finished. And he had this, piece of paper that he had from working with this, and he just, felt all frustrated and pitched it, and it landed there, and he was like, oh, it's finished. And so sometimes that happens. There are these opportunities for chance that if you leave yourself open to, it can create really beautiful endings.
Absolutely, and what a great way to communicate that to artists, especially young artists, who might think if it doesn't exist how it existed in my head, then it doesn't work. But really embracing change as to the finish point and beyond, right? You can gain so much more from the work.
Yeah,
so it's exciting.
Treat.
Yeah.
So let's come over and talk about Deborah's work.
Yeah. So here we have this a collage. We have this, collage similar to where we started with Andrew's work, this sort of non-linear series of images. And these, Deborah Orloff is a photographic artist based in Toledo. And she is really thinking about components of photography that are just absolute, I would say, nestled in what photography is. So photography and memory are so closely related, and photography and personal history, because we all have personal photographs, is very related. And what Deborah is doing is this sort of personal investigation of her her history based on actual location in Eastern Europe and other European areas, and this sort of migration of her Jewish heritage. And with these images, you can see this sort of layering that's happening with the work, and you'll see hints of sort of a landscape in the background for most of these, or some sort of architectural reference, a reference to a particular place. And then on top of that, or near it, is an actual family photograph. Again, not a copy of it, the real photograph that she is carefully manipulating, most often through sort of dissecting a particular person and removing them, or a particular component and taking that out, so it becomes a frame in which we see the background image or map or location or landscape or so forth. So I think this really talks about memory and loss, physical loss of losing a history, or losing knowledge of a history, or losing particular people, or losing the memory of them.
Right. That absence becomes the important component. And so it's oftentimes we forget that absence takes up space.
It does.
And so not only is it shown in these absences, that then we have spaces behind that reference either particular killing field or a space that was a part of her familial history and location.
Right.
So within the individual works, but also within the display, there are absences that become important visual cues that just echo what she's saying within the works, and I think it's really smart.
So smart, so beautifully done. And I think the quiet display presentation method where there's enough space around the work to kind of just have this sense of absence, I think, in the kind of framing presentation, just a little bit of breathing room so doesn't feel tight or confined, and these open spaces that actually the wall becomes, as you mentioned, just as an important part of the work as the actual frame pieces.
Yeah. Really brilliant way to investigate grief and
Absolutely.
loss.
Yeah. And I think just, I mean, we can see the handwork of the cutting out of the individuals and something. So that touch and that handling of those materials feels very important to me, because there's a physical closeness and an emotional closeness that I think we're trying to draw upon there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's head on over to this wall here and talk about Phillip's work.
Yeah. This work is, these are 3 paintings by Phillip Buntin, and he is based in Kent, Ohio. I think these are beautifully complex and quiet all at the same time. Phillip's work has a lot to do with the uncertainty of perception. So I think this work, all the work in the show, but I'll mention it here, it's worth the time to sit with these pieces. There are beautiful layers and marks. Again, I think it comes back to seeing these in person is a very different experience than on a computer or a photograph of them or something like that. The sort of gloss of them, the sort of built up paint, the subtlety and color and texture that becomes layered, even just the edge, which is not something I normally pay attention to in a painting, but I love the just subtle crossover to the edge of the work. Phillip often references the micro and the macro. So aerial shots or aerial imagery and microscopic imagery is often a source point for his work.
You could imagine them as waterways.
Oh,
like
absolutely.
If you pull far enough back.
Absolutely.
As a through line.
And landscapes too, I think from a plane, or something like that, tributaries and so forth. That become very engaging to me. And I think the scale is another experience you have with the pieces in person that I think it's important to get the sense of scale standing in front of it, because they're much experiencing them as a 30 by 30, 40 by 40 piece, and that one-on-one ratio that you have with them is an important component of that experience.
It's also really interesting how he plays with transparency in these works.
Absolutely.
And so you mentioned the edge, but it's not just the edge of the piece. There's a halo effect that happens just by the nature of having a stretcher. And these, I think, are on linen. It's a really fine fabric. And the way that he's playing with our understanding of material, they almost seem like they have a resin atop them.
Yeah.
So that really high gloss that's happening there. And then you also see the halo of that stretcher that contains the piece.
Right.
You can't quite see it particularly well through digital media, but to see it in person, it has a kind of a ghosting effect that's really interesting.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I also had a very sort of emotional experience looking at them from across the gallery and having one experience and then moving closer to them and finding all these details and layers and surface relationships of picture plane and surface that became so engaging for me.
And we're going to talk more about layering and picture plane and transparencies when we walk over and chat about Gretchen's work.
Yes. So on these two walls, we have the work of Gretchen Durst Jacobs, and she is a painter and printmaker based in Dayton, Ohio. And as Kat so eloquently mentioned, we have paintings that are so based in color, just rich, intense sometimes color, beautiful surface quality with in particular these images have a gold paint on them. And one thing I'm particularly drawn to with Gretchen's work is the kind of the full body experience of the mark making. Like her whole body is invested in the making. This isn't done you know, like close up.
Yeah.
It is just.
There's a surety in that motion
Absolutely.
too. Like there's no tentative
Yeah.
experience. Like to look at the motion of the arm that it would take to make that mark, you can't do it slowly.
Right.
I have decided on this movement and this application, and
Absolutely.
and there's a history in that.
Yes.
That doesn't come just like that.
Absolutely. So we're seeing an artifact of an intention, as you mentioned, and the mark making from that intention, right? And then another thing you'll notice with this work is there's this grid component. On this image in particular, it's very present, right? It's divided into 12 equal squares. It's very laid on there, you know, in a very structural way. It feels like it's put on top, okay, of the paint and just slightly blending in with the orange on that grid. Whereas this one in comparison, there is a structural component, and in particular with these red lines, but it's not, it's sort of embedded into the painting. There are areas where it sort of disappears and then reappears. It's not an even grid like the image I just referenced. There's 45-degree angles and sort of triangular components and rectangular components. So the division of the picture plane is completely different. And I think the way it breaks up our sense of looking into the painting completely changes with that choice of separation of grid, whether it's sort of on the top or embedded into the layers.
And also the mark making within this one, it's far more present in this piece where you see the hand through what we would understand to be either chalk or charcoal pencil that they've gone back in and made marks to ensure that you know the artist hand is there.
Absolutely.
Carving through it. And what I think is really smart about this layout too is that because of that grid, then the viewer sees the individual small pieces as perhaps little bits that were taken out. So it has this kind of morphing that happens there.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think this piece is a really great example of that transparency and movement between, and how each of those can stand alone as a lovely piece, but
Right.
together it's a real treat to see how they connect.
Yeah, yeah. And with the mark making, we talked about that sort of energy, maybe a sort of layering of chaos, intentionality in that, and how the grid can be a controlling agent to that. So that's one of the ways it links to the Metamorphosis show theme, is this sort of, open, expressive movement, but then this sort of controlling component of it changes the way we look at it, it changes the picture plane, and it changes the sense of energy that is evoked through the work.
Yeah. And so I think we'll move to our last artist over here. We have Marcella Hackbardt.
Yeah, so Marcella is based in Gambier, Ohio, and we have her work on this wall here and extending into an installation that is on this entire wall here. Marcella is, I should say, based in photography, but we see this sort of movement into other materials here and more of a sculptural installation that includes photography as components of it. One of the larger themes that Marcella is working with here is Alzheimer's. So her father currently has Alzheimer's. She's been a caretaker in part to her father. And you'll notice that these particular pieces here, there's a clear imagery of a brain, but it's actually made out of a doily. And this is actually AI work, which, or she's
Using it as
a tool and kind of collaborating with it. And I find this a really interesting, you're both a creator and a curator at the same time. I love that sort of integration of this different tool as we're just sort of discovering and acknowledging this as a sort of greater society. But she's working with the doily, again, a sort of representation of the domesticity, the home, and also traditional women's work. And we can remember caretaking historically and sometimes currently is based in sort of the woman's job. A lot of the doilies, as you can kind of see both on the wall and on the table and in the imagery, they're fraying. And so this is alluding to dementia and Alzheimer's and how the functions of neurobiology are fraying as well. So there's a sense of age to that, because usually, their fragility, they are fragile objects, and they tend to fray as they get older, as does the body.
Yeah, there's this nexus that she creates between her photography, her implemented imagery, and found object create a really interesting intersection for us to explore the idea of memory, our memory, lost memory, and how we approach it. Like, what are the pieces, parts that create core memories, perhaps?
Absolutely, yeah, and just that accumulation of a lifetime of memories as well. The sort of brain doilies are also coupled with these artifacts, these broken artifacts, such as angels' wings or birds or figurines that have been intentionally broken by the artist, by Marcella, and then compiled together in this still life. So we're seeing fragments, and this talks about a couple of different things, sort of nicely tied to Deb Orloff's work, just the fallibility of memory, where fragments of memory, but also bringing back back, again, that word fragile, the fragile nature of these domestic items, of this personal history. She's photographing items that are usually collected and displayed, are kind of special objects of the home or part of personal collections. She's destroying them and then bringing them together. So we're looking at these components, which ties me back to memory.
Absolutely.
And fragments of memory, but also reminding me of the fragility of all that.
I just saw a little statement online about I am the encyclopedia of everything I've noticed.
Yeah.
And so I think about Marcella's work in that regard. This piece so beautifully represents that, and her calling to, and perhaps grief over, likely grief over the fragmentation that she's experiencing in her own family, and how then does that compilation of the things I've noticed dissipate, change? Do the pages, no longer exist? Do they fray?
Absolutely.
It's just a really beautiful honoring, I think, of the experience that she's having.
Yeah.
That I hope is also healing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the core, just coming back to the core of the whole show, was really that space of transition from one phase into another. And what is that place, right? From a psychological level, from a materiality level, from an emotional level, from a physical level, et cetera, et cetera. And that transition is sometimes smooth, but most often not. And so I think this is a great place to end, because this is also very current for Marcella. This is a very current place for her, and work that's coming out of an actual metamorphosis that she's experiencing in her life. But I think we can all relate to, because we've all had to deal with, family history and personal objects and components, and we all have a body. We all experience this change, which is a constant. And so it's my hope that this show brings that together from so many different perspectives, that it gives the viewers the opportunity to reflect on that in their own life.
Perfect.
Great.
This is Metamorphosis, curated by Tracy Longley-Cook. Thank you to the Ohio Arts Council's board, the governor and the legislature who support the Ohio Arts Council, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists.
Okay. Thank you.